You've probably heard this one. On July 4th, 1776, King George III supposedly wrote in his diary, "Nothing of importance happened today." It's one of the most quoted lines in American history class. There's just one problem. King George III never kept a diary. That line was never written. Not that day, not any day. Today, we go further than any episode before. Not just what didn't happen, but what actually happened. 3,000 miles away, the moment London found out America was gone. This is episode 3 of 250 Docs. 15 minutes. Stay for all of it. This story ends in a war. This myth has been repeated for generations, in books, in classrooms, even in television shows. The quote gets used as a punchline. The most powerful king in the world, so out of touch he didn't even notice he'd lost an empire. It's a great story. It shows up in movies, in trivia nights, in history teachers' favorite one-liners. And it's been debunked for years by actual historians, yet it keeps coming back, generation after generation, because it's simply too satisfying not to repeat. Historians have traced it appearing in newspapers as early as the 1930s, presented as fact with no source at all. Nobody has ever found the original diary page, because there wasn't one. And still, every July 4th, someone repeats it as though it were gospel. So where did it actually come from? Historian Arnold Hunt at the British Library traced the real source, a diary entry written by a completely different king 13 years later on the other side of the English Channel. On July 14th, 1789, the day the Bastille fell in France, King Louis XVI wrote a single word in his hunting journal: nothing. He meant he hadn't caught anything that day. Somewhere along the way, someone swapped one king for another, one revolution for another, and stitched together a quote that never existed, but sounded exactly right. A myth built from 2 different centuries, 2 different countries, 2 different kings, and nobody noticed for decades. So if the diary quote is fake, what actually happened when the news reached London? It didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened in pieces, carried by ship over weeks. British military commanders in America mailed copies of the printed declaration back home as evidence. One package reached a government minister in early August. Newspapers picked it up soon after. By the second week of August, 1776, almost exactly 250 years ago from right now, the news was finally common knowledge across London. No single rider, no single headline, just documents crossing an ocean, arriving in scattered pieces, slowly becoming undeniable. Some Londoners read about their own colonies declaring independence in the morning paper over breakfast, like any other piece of news. For a king who supposedly didn't notice, this was, by every account, impossible to ignore. When King George III finally addresses Parliament about the colonies, there is nothing indifferent about his tone. He calls the actions of the colonies a rebellion, formed by men, in his words, engaged in a conspiracy to overthrow lawful government. He does not shrug. He does not dismiss it. He asks Parliament for more soldiers than Britain's own army can supply. So the Crown does something that will define the war for years. It hires tens of thousands of German soldiers. mostly from Hesse. Paying foreign princes to send their own men to fight and die on colonial soil. This was not a king ignoring a distant colony. This was a king mobilizing the largest force the British Empire had ever sent across an ocean. Whatever else is true about that summer, indifference was not it. Not everyone in London wanted this war. A vocal group of British politicians argued forcefully against fighting the colonies at all. Some out of principle, some because they worried Britain simply couldn't win a war 3,000 miles from home against an enemy fighting on its own land. These voices lost the argument. Parliament backed the king's course. But the debate itself tells you something the myth erases completely. Britain wasn't a single mind cheering for war. It was a country as divided about this conflict as the colonies were about independence itself. History rarely splits as cleanly as the myths make it sound, on either side of the ocean. What follows is 8 years of war. Battles fought across the colonies and at sea. Tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides never make it home. Entire towns are burned. Families are split down the middle. Brothers fighting brothers. Neighbors reporting neighbors, depending on which side of the argument they landed on. This is the part the myth quietly erases. If the king truly didn't care, none of this happens. Armies don't cross an ocean for something of no importance. Fortunes aren't spent for 8 straight years on a war nobody in London is paying attention to. By the time the war ends, roughly 1 in 20 American men of fighting age has died in it. One of the deadliest conflicts per capita in the country's history. None of that happens by accident. None of it happens because nobody noticed. So if historians debunked this decades ago, why does the quote still show up everywhere? Quoted in books, repeated in classrooms, even written into television scripts as historical fact, because it's satisfying. It turns a complicated 8-year war into a single ironic punchline. The powerful, oblivious king, blind to the moment his empire started slipping away. The truth is messier and less quotable. A real king, genuinely alarmed, mobilizing an empire's resources, sending an invasion force most colonists never expected to survive. Myths win because they're simple. History is rarely that generous. This isn't the first myth this series has taken apart. It won't be the last. The pattern keeps repeating, because a good story always travels faster than a footnote. There's a cost to this story that rarely gets its own chapter. Roughly 1 in 5 colonists actually opposes independence, loyal to the crown for reasons of faith, family, business, or simple belief that rebellion was the wrong answer. Thousands of these loyalist families lose everything. Homes seized, businesses destroyed. Tens of thousands flee north into Canada rather than live in the country their neighbors are building. This wasn't clean. It wasn't one side against a distant king. It was neighbors against neighbors, families splitting apart over a document most of them never got to vote on. Independence wasn't a single unified moment for the colonists either. It was as divided and as costly as the war it started. Which brings us to right now. This week marks 250 years since that news finally became undeniable in London. The moment an ocean away when the fake quote insists nothing happened. Most people marking America's 250th year this summer have never heard this half of the story. What was happening on the other side of the Atlantic, in the rooms where the decision to fight back was actually made. The Declaration wasn't just a document written in Philadelphia. It was a challenge delivered across an ocean to the most powerful military force on Earth, and received not with a shrug, but with an army. 2 capitals, 1 document, and a response the myth never wanted you to know about. Every episode of this series ends up here, eventually, at the gap between what a document says and what it takes to actually live up to it. The Declaration promised freedom to a country that, in 1776, still enslaved people, still excluded women from any real voice, still expanded onto land that belonged to someone else first. The war that followed the fake king's fake indifference didn't close that gap. It just won the argument about who would get to keep trying to close it. 250 years later, the argument isn't finished. It rarely is. Every war, every signature, every myth we've corrected in this series, all of it was always about the same unfinished sentence. So the next time someone repeats that line about the king and his diary, you'll know the real story. Not indifference, not a shrug. An empire that noticed immediately and spent 8 years and thousands of lives making sure everyone knew it.